If you want to motivate somebody, take an interest in them. Care. That's it. Just care. And if you don't care, you have no right to manage anybody.
Welcome to the EQ Gangster podcast, where you will learn practical tools to grow your mental and emotional health and intelligence to be the best version of yourself, both at work and at home. It is real, raw, and transformational. The journey of emotional growth isn't easy, but it's worth it. I believe in you. This episode is sponsored by Classical Conversations. Since 1997, Classical Conversations has been equipping families like yours with the resources to homeschool with confidence, following a classical curriculum rooted in a Christ-centered worldview alongside other families in a local community. Homeschooling is doable with Classical Conversations. Check out classicalconversations.com/Gibbons for more information. Again, that's classicalconversations.com/Gibbons, Gibbens. EQ Gangsters. All right, so I just finished an amazing interview. This is going to be the intro to this episode. So I interviewed Dr. Margaret Heffernan from the UK, and she is amazing, y'all. She has been a CEO for decades, and now she's been for another probably 2 or 3 decades, has been coaching C-level executives, CEOs, COOs, all those C-level folks. She's built and founded and started multiple tech companies. And I'm going to read her bio to y'all, but the interview is fire. She has so much wisdom and so many insights and so many, y'all know I am a question junkie, so many powerful questions that she chews on and that she poses to the leaders and the executives that she coaches. So Dr. Margaret Heffernan produced, for those of y'all that are on YouTube, you see me looking away, I'm reading my notes here, has produced programs for the BBC for 13 years. She then moved to the US, where she spearheaded multimedia productions for Intuit, the Learning Company and Standard&Poors, S&P. She was chief executive of InfoMation Corporation, ZineZone Corporation, and then iCast Corporation. Was named one of the top 25 by Streaming Media magazine and one of the top 100 media executives by The Hollywood Reporter. The author of 6 books, Margaret's third book, Willful Blindness, Why We Ignore the Obvious at Our Peril, was named one of the most important business books of the decade by the Financial Times. In 2015, she was awarded the Transmission Prize for a bigger prize, Why Competition Isn't Everything and How We Do Better, described as meticulously researched, engagingly written, universally relevant, and hard to fault. Her TED Talks have been seen by over 12 million people, and in 2015, TED published Beyond Measure, The Big Impact of Small Changes. Her most recent book, Uncharted, How to Map the Future, was published in 2020. It quickly became a bestseller and was nominated for the Financial Times Best Business Book Award, was one of Bloomberg's best books of 2021, and was chosen as the Medium Best of the Best Business Book. She's a professor of practice at the University of Bath, lead faculty for the Forward Institute's Responsible Leadership Program, and through American Company mentors CEOs and senior executives of major global organizations. She chairs the board of DACS and has advised the Casey Review into the culture and standards of the Metropolitan Police and the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse led by Alexis J. That is her background. She is amazing, y'all. I'm telling you, if I was you, I would have a notebook, pen ready to jot down her skinny, because she has phenomenal insights. Thank you for being a part of this. Thank you for sharing. If this resonates with you all, if you've got another fellow executive, a fellow leader, senior leader that her content resonates with, man, share this episode. Thank you for rating, reviewing, subscribing, y'all. We hit we're at 1,000 downloads per episode now, y'all. That's crazy crazy. That is awesome. So thank you all so much for your support. And I really hope you're enjoying the content, especially from amazing leaders that I'm getting an opportunity to interact with and interview. It's great to see you, ma'am.
Great to see you too.
I'm so excited. I'm so excited, ma'am. Oh my goodness. I have been waiting for this. And thank you so much for being willing to do this. I know we're like many, many time zones apart, but I really appreciate you being willing to do this.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm looking forward to it.
I did want to just share a couple takeaways that I got from your TED talk that were just mind blowing, from why it's time to forget the pecking order at work. Just your concept around, the mortar matters, not just the
Mhm.
bricks, and that mortar being the social capital. So I love that. And I'm in the emotional intelligence space. I was
Right.
emotionally
Yeah,
clueless.
EQ kind of is the mortar, isn't it, really?
That's right. Yes, ma'am. So
Yeah.
how did you start your journey to becoming a world-class leader?
As a dictation typist at the BBC. Um,
Wow.
I mean, it's interesting. I have kind of mixed feelings about this now, but I think I'm not sure it's the smartest thing to do, but there definitely are advantages to starting at the bottom of the heap, in the sense that by the time you get to the top, you have been in most kinds of jobs. And so there's an awful lot about doing those jobs at lots of different levels that you understand because you've been there, and you understand. So I think often, what's really annoying, what's really insulting, how does your time get wasted? Who encourages you? And it, of course, in broadcasting, if you've done just about every job there is, then it's quite hard for people to bamboozle you, right?
Great point.
So it's kind of slow, and I would never, blanket recommend it to anybody, but I think it gave me very solid grounding in terms of knowing what it's like to be at those different places within a very large institution. It meant that I had some absolutely fantastic, fantastic bosses and managers, and some real stinkers, right? And so I think it just gave me quite a broad and deep sense of what work is like, and
Now,
quite an abiding passion, I think, for trying to create an environment in which people really could do their most creative work. Because I was lucky to have some fantastic bosses who did let me do phenomenal work. And it was a long time before I realized that they were really exceptional people. I thought that's how everybody did things.
right. So what did you discover in terms of creating the right environment to bring the best out of people?
Well, I think the first thing I learned was not to make assumptions of people just because the job that they're in. Or if you have to make assumptions about people, make positive ones, not negative ones, right? So assume the best, assume they're talented, assume goodwill. Generally speaking, I've found that those are pretty safe assumptions. Don't give them demeaning work to do, things like that. Or if you do, explain why you have to. I think probably the single most important thing I discovered is, we have all this nonsense talk about how do we incentivize people. I think the single most motivating thing at work is for a boss or a manager to take interest in you. I think that's more motivating than anything. I have never, ever paid people cash bonuses, for example. I think money is a horrible form of motivation, and it doesn't work. So it's expensive and useless. But taking an interest in someone, who they are, what they want, what their real skills are, what their hopes and dreams are, that's fantastically, fantastically motivating. And for people to go into work and feel that they are known and that they're recognized and that they matter is the most important thing you can do. And what shocks me to this day is how rare that is.
Wow. That's fascinating. I call it SHUV, SHUV, seen, heard, understood, and valued.
Yep.
How can we make someone feel that when I think it takes that self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, social
Yeah.
management to really maximize that in somebody.
And it's just incredible how rare it is. So I spent all of last week teaching a fantastic program to MBA students about how to negotiate a values conflict at work if you're asked to do something that doesn't sit very well with you. And it hinges quite profoundly on understanding the values of the person that you're negotiating with, to understand, is there somewhere we might share some values somewhere that I can speak to? And what are the things that matter to that person so that I can really connect with them? And my students were, quite experienced, very nice people. But really all they wanted to do was go in and say, this is what I feel. This is what I want. It's like, and why do you think that's going to get you anything? If you're not even interested enough to think about the other person as another person, why should they give you the time of day? Right? You've created no meaningful connection with them. And of course, all of this, right? But I was sort of shocked that, these are people in their late 20s, early 30s. They've got some significant work experience under their belt. They're investing in themselves, which I think is fantastic. Most of them had come to England to do it. So they've made quite a bold step. And yet their capacity to think about other people as other people, to understand that that's really important, was very shallow. I mean, I thought you'd understand it just because it's polite, right? But that actually, if you want to get the best out of people, you have to understand them or attempt to understand them, was not really part of their education. They've been taught to get good grades for themselves, good grades to get themselves into good universities, good grades to get themselves jobs. And this thing about, yes, but how are you going to work with others? Not on the curriculum.
I've done a number of speaking engagements with executives, and I've asked them how often or when was the last time you felt seen, heard, understood, and valued, and many of them couldn't remember the last time that happened. Why do you think?
Wow.
Why do you think leaders are not good at this? Where did we mess up?
Well, I'd say one thing, which is I now mentor CEOs of very big global companies. And I would say some of them are very, very, very good at this. And the fact that they're good at it is why they are where they are. It's not the only reason, but it's, I think, a very big part of the reason. Some are catastrophically bad at it, for sure. And I think some of it is, I think there's still in some areas, in some industries more than others, in some parts of the world more than others, a belief that career advancement is all about skills, technical skills, engineering skills, financial skills, that kind of thing. That if you've got the biggest brain in the room, then you're set for life. So I think that's one reason. I think that because an awful lot of our industries now require quite a lot of what I think of as left brain skills, those have been overdeveloped and everything else has been kind of ignored. And that will get you quite a long way for quite a long time. On the other hand, I'm an optimist and I am really impressed by the degree to which we're having this conversation, which nobody was having, when I was coming up through the ranks. I just happened to be lucky to meet some really exceptionally fine human beings, I think. But you ask a great question, because I often think, how did we get into a state where we thought not thinking about people was viable? And I think, to be honest, I think you can blame some of this on technology. We can do so much without having to talk to anybody. I think remote work actually doesn't help in this regard at all. We think of work as more transactional now probably than ever. And the reality is that the only thing that's really changed since the Industrial Revolution in some ways is that the factory is now dispersed. The assembly line is now in our house, But so I'm kind of amazed that the messages that I put out or the books that I've written, I'm kind of amazed that there's still a revelation. But I mean, I'm kind of grateful they are, obviously, and I'm grateful they're still out there. But I guess I have, and I suspect a lot of writers fall into this trap. You sort of think, well, if I've written about it, I've fixed it. But still, there's clearly quite a long way to go.
Okay, so that's great. Awesome, awesome. And I love those insights. What have you observed? So you just did that class, that program for MBA students. Now you also work with the other spectrum of leaders, right? The senior C-level, C-suite executives. What have you found some areas that they need to work on or improve the most? What are some of the trends that you've observed at that level?
I would say two things. I think they need to develop their own curiosity about the world, which is they're all very aware that they have to stay on top of their industry. I think they would be much healthier, happier people if they also developed curiosity about something that is nothing to do with their industry, just to give their brain a bit of a workout. It's a little bit like, if I'm a cyclist. So I have very strong legs, right? I'm not a weightlifter, right? My upper body strength is just about nil. So that's unbalanced, right? And I would be a healthier person if I thought a little bit more about my whole body and less about, my powerful bike legs, right? I think that most business leaders, because the job is so demanding, believe that if they just focus on the stuff they absolutely need, they will be the best they can be. And I don't think that's true. I think that, if you talk to any elite sports coaches, they will tell you, you don't just work on the stuff you absolutely need. You have to mix it up a bit. It gives you a more flexible mind. It gives you a variety of thinking styles. It means that you notice more. And so I think that's one of the things I would say about some of the very, very fine people I work with, which is they need to mix it up more. They need to have a wider worldview. I would also say that they need to come to terms with the fact that productivity is not about hours of input. It's about output. And, I bang this drum almost every day of my working life. And I understand it's really counterintuitive that if I can get a lot of fantastic work done in 40 hours a week, surely I can get 50% more done if I do 60 hours a week. But all of the productivity experiments we have ever done since the first one in 1888 shows that that is not true, because our brains get tired, and as they get tired, they make mistakes. And now you need the extra time to clean up the mistakes you've made. So having respect for the fact that mostly what we do at work these days is thinking. Thinking is a physical activity. It maxes out at about 40 hours a week. And yeah, you can keep going in a crunch or a crisis. But long term, the dilatory effects of very long working days are horrifying. There's a fantastic longitudinal study of 75,000 people across their entire careers. And what that shows is that if you work 55 hours a week or more over the course of your career on average, you are subject to earlier vocabulary loss, depression, early onset dementia, and earlier failure of critical thinking. It's what you and I would call wear and tear. This stuff is bad for us. It's like, driving your car into the ground and never getting it serviced. And looping back to curiosity, being able to look away from problems, being able to do things that may not have an immediate tactical impact on your work. This is a way of keeping your brain healthy.
How can a leader develop radical curiosity?
Get home in time to have dinner with the kids. Right? It's a good start. Listen to them, take them seriously, be prepared to have arguments with them. It's really excellent experience. To stay in touch with what's happening in the world. It's very good for your kids. And boy, does it help you develop emotional intelligence, as I'm sure you know better than I do. I think that's really important. Go to the movies, go to the theater, go to a concert. The arts are very, very helpful for the human mind and for emotional intelligence. And the battering that humanities and the arts have taken over the last 20, 30 years is costing all of us a lot in terms of our humanity, our empathy, and our imaginative capability. And in a world where we are less and less able to make confident forecasts, it has never been more important for business leaders to have the power of imagination. And, too much work makes Jack a dull boy and Jill a dull woman. You really need to be willing and able to explore and to have fun. I spent quite a lot of time talking to people in the improv community because it struck me, especially as an entrepreneur, and when I was writing about entrepreneurs, that they're fantastic improvisers. They absolutely have to make it up as they go along because they're doing something they've never done before. And one of the things I learned in all of the research I did in that space was this fantastic mantra that the improv community has, which is fun disables fear. And if you can have fun, you can just think much more diversely in a much less linear way. And being able to think that way is fantastically valuable when the world is, as it is now, full of surprises.
That is so powerful. So it's so funny that you said improv. So my daughter, she's 15, and thank God for EQ because I've needed it as she's gone into these teen years.
Yeah, well, don't you just? I mean, parenting, I think, is in many ways, one of the greatest management programs in the universe.
That's right. That's exactly right. And how incredibly exposing, right? Just it reveals the areas that I need to work on. It really
Me too.
does. Yeah,
Me
it really
too.
does. So my daughter, we do Brazilian jiu-jitsu,
Oh,
and
wow.
which it's neat that you said, to find something else, because I love doing podcasting and YouTubing and executive coaching and speaking and all that stuff. But I also equally love Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu because it keeps it's three-dimensional real-time chess, and
Yeah.
there's almost an infinite number of moves that you will never, ultimately will never master. And so, which is another concept that's fascinating to me is, let me just go back to the improv. So one thing was watching my daughter do improv. And when she was doing the improv, I'm like, man, this is complete lame waste of time. And then I'm like, and then I like really dialed into what they were doing and some of the games that they were playing. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is the entrepreneurship journey. Like this is, everything is new, and there's not a neural pathway for what just happened. Like, these improv students are having to build their road real time, which is like every day as an entrepreneur. How did you develop your ability to have that emotional and leadership agility throughout your leadership and business arc?
I don't really know, to be honest. I think it probably helped me a great deal that when I was 8, we moved from Texas to the Netherlands. And, my parents had never lived outside the United States. We didn't know anybody who'd ever lived outside the United States. So you're rapidly thrown into a situation where you have to make it up as you go along. I decided to learn Dutch because I thought I don't really like not understanding what people are saying and not knowing what the billboards say and stuff like that. But I think when you're really thrown into the deep end like that, you get very good at change. You just have to. It's just survival, right? Clearly not everybody does, but I remember somebody on an exec program that I was teaching on asked me this fantastic question, which is, how do you get good at change? And my answer, which seems a little pat, but was sincere, was you just do it a lot, right? So I changed schools a lot. I went to an international school, and then I went to a French school, and then I went to a Dutch school, and then we moved to England, and then I went to an American school in England, and then I went to an English school in England. And so I was kind of resetting quite frequently before the time I was 18. And I think that was just very good for me. And I think one of the things that happens if you do that is you're not doing this consciously at all at that age. You become very, very good at horizon scanning, because if you don't know what's going on and you have no power, which as an 8-year-old, you have no power, then the only thing that will make you feel anything is keeping your eyes on what's going on out there and trying to pick it up and trying to pick up the patterns and being really observant, and how do people here behave and function, and what do I need to do to fit in here? So I think that's very good early experience. And it's I think it's one of these infinitely fascinating subjects, which is when you're bringing up your children, you think you want them to have huge amounts of stability. And on one level, you really do. You don't want them wondering if you love them, right? But I also think that if you give them too much, then they might not develop that horizon scanning and that curiosity about what's going on out here. And so, I think in some ways I was just sort of lucky in that respect. I think that's where a lot of it came from, because in the end, I think that confidence isn't about knowing what to do. I think it's just knowing you can figure it out.
So not necessarily, that's an excellent point. Confidence doesn't necessarily have to come from competence, but from
But
knowing that you can figure stuff out.
yeah, so I think it has to do with, it's about having the competence, the confidence that you have the competence to figure it out.
Got it.
So, for example, when I was running tech companies in the States, I couldn't then, and I still can't write a line of code. But I knew how to run teams of people. I had an absolutely central belief that just as writers and poets and musicians and actors that I worked with in broadcasting are creative people, engineers are definitely creative people. And that therefore my job was getting the best out of really creative people. They just happened to work in technology instead of media. And that analogy turned out, to be pretty true. And it didn't mean that I didn't learn a lot about technology. Don't get me wrong. I didn't just kind of blithely swim through it. But the basic thing about how do you bring together a group of people and get them to make something that's never been made before is pretty similar. The only difference is, in broadcasting, everybody worships deadlines. And in technology, nobody ever hits deadlines.
Fascinating. Well, and then so on that vein, one of the, you've got TED Talks, and of course I'm going to put that in the introduction, all your bio and the different resources and books and videos that you've done. How can a leader develop our ability to increase the mortar, as you would call it, that social capital? How can we get better at
Mhm.
that as leaders?
Lots of things. I think spending time with people is really crucial, absolutely fundamental. Asking questions, always asking questions, and not interrogations, but I mean, again, it comes to taking an interest in people, right? So where did you come from? What did your parents do? Why did they do that? What was that like? Um, I mean, I think again, and so much of this is fluke, really. Uh, when I was working in broadcasting, I learned how to interview people. Learning how to interview people is a fantastic skill. I mean, people think of it in terms of recruiting. It's not about recruiting. It's you meet somebody in the elevator, you meet somebody at a conference. They know stuff that you don't know. And if you're smart, you'll find out what it is. So you ask them lots of what I think of as WH questions. Who, what, where, when, why, which. And you can, if you think that everybody you meet knows a lot of stuff you don't, and your job is to find out what is it they know, you will learn a lot every day. And they will go away thinking you are the most interesting person they ever met because you were smart enough to take an interest in them.
Brilliant. I like to call that the treasure hunter. I like to be a treasure
Mm-hmm.
hunter to
Yep.
just try to discover the hidden treasure in people.
I think that is exactly the right analogy. And it's so interesting because this program I was teaching last week, on the last day, we were doing paired role plays. And on the last day, we had an odd number. And so I decided to pair up with the student who didn't have a partner. And I realized, of course, I had a huge disadvantage because I've taught this particular case, many times. And I've seen some students really crack it brilliantly. But one of the things I observed was that everybody doing the role play went in with a plan as to how the conversation was going to go. And not one of them started with a meaningful question. And I thought, well, that's like, I mean, if this is a negotiation, you are starting with your arms and legs tied. How are you doing? You had to go, I know you had to go to a meeting. How did the meeting go? What was the problem? Why was the problem? How did you resolve it? How are you feeling about it now? If you start a negotiation like that, the person's on your side before it's even started. And instead, everybody just came in with, okay, this is my beef with you, and this is how I want you to change. Why would I? Why would I? You don't care about me. You've just demonstrated you don't care about me.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Who brings the best out of you?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, people ask great questions, right? I mean, I would probably say my children, if only because they're really not afraid of me. And they will argue anything. I mean, my son will argue the hind legs off the table. So I think, and I love that because I learned from them. But I would also say most of the CEOs that I mentor, because, I don't work with anybody I don't really enjoy working with, and it's a mutual choice to work together. And so we both bring a lot of commitment to the relationship. And so that means we really want to get the best out of each other. And that's one reason I love it so much is, they're always hard problems, and therefore they're very interesting to think about with somebody who really cares about them.
And what type of leaders do you enjoy working with the most?
Mm. I really like working with leaders who appreciate that to change doesn't mean you were doing something wrong before. It means you found something better to do this time. Which is a complicated way, I guess, of saying they're not defensive. So I'm thinking of one client in particular at the moment And we have great discussions and debates and so on. But he's also a pragmatist. So by the time we finished, he is going to do something. And I know that sounds kind of obvious, but there are other people who like to think about it a lot, but not actually change anything. And that becomes frustrating, right? Because in the end, the work we're doing together is fundamentally pragmatic. It's not philosophical. So I've definitely worked with people who have been very, very determined that they're very good already, but they can always get better. And they're quite hungry to do that. And they're fantastic to work with because they'll try stuff and they'll learn from it, and they'll, and we learn together. And they're willing to experiment by doing something differently today than they did it yesterday. And that's fantastically rewarding because in a way, it's like an experiment. No matter what the outcome, you are bound to learn something. If I have a hypothesis that if I do X, Y will change, well, whether Y changes or not, I will have learned something about my hypothesis. So people who are that undefensive and that open and that eager to explore are fantastic people to work with.
And I love that. It's one of my favorite things. I call it being hungry, humble, smart, and appreciative.
Mhm.
And I think that combination, those are my favorite leaders. That's who brings the best out of me, who I bring the best out of. And I try to be the type of leader that I would want to work with.
Yeah.
And what, from your perch of decades and decades of leadership and mentoring and coaching leaders, what have you observed being the primary differences between being a good leader and a world-class leader?
Hmm. Well, it's certainly that capacity to change. I worked some time ago with a guy who had really done a phenomenal job as CEO of a very big, difficult business. And he was very, very bright, and he really understood that everything he'd done and everything he was had been great for what the company was, but it was not what the company would need in the future. And, would kind of laughingly say he was a dinosaur, but it wasn't a joke. He wouldn't leave and he wouldn't change. And that was, I think, it was very frustrating for me. I think it was actually quite frustrating for him because intellectually he wanted to change, and actually he just couldn't. He just absolutely could not stop using all the kind of tools that he'd become very good at using. And some of this was tied up in his gigantic loyalty to the business. He couldn't imagine it without him. I don't think he wanted ever to imagine leaving. And it's very difficult because he knew he had to go, and he knew that the business needed a very different kind of leader for the future. So he would get, you'd see him move to change his position, but he'd always go back. He would always go back. And, I had a lot of empathy for him because I think it was excruciating for him. I mean, I think in some ways it's almost like an addiction, you shouldn't, but you do. But that inability to change when you see that you have to, I think is just extremely painful.
Sure, absolutely. They become emotionally and leadership rigid, and their emotional
Yeah.
agility is hindered or atrophied or whatever the impact. How have you been able to maintain over the course of decades of leadership, hungry and humble?
Well, I think I have quite a low boredom threshold for a start. And part of what that means is I'm not terribly interested in repeating myself.
I'm always hungry to learn something or to go somewhere new or do something new or meet someone new. And I think I think having a low boredom threshold means that I'm always doing something I haven't ever done before. So it may be I've never spoken to a particular audience before. It may be, I never really do the same presentation twice. And that means it's more work for me, but it's more interesting. My books have similarities, but they're not the same by any stretch of the imagination. And that keeps you humble because you start off thinking, oh, this will be fun, this will be different. And then you think, yeah, well, it's different. But I don't really know how to do this. And I think most writers will tell you that, however many books you've written, there's always a point where you get to where you're not quite sure what you're doing. And that really keeps you humble. It really keeps you humble. And I know lots of people in creative fields who feel this, if you're painting a painting, you've never painted this painting before. You've never written that piece of music. So I think it's that if you're doing something that's genuinely creative, you always know you don't quite know what's going to happen.
That's great. That's awesome. Okay. I want to set up a little scenario here. Let's say I'm one of the CEOs or executives that you're coaching and we are meeting for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
What question would you ask me to get an idea of where I'm at as a leader?
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess my first question is usually something along the lines of, what do you want to get out of mentoring? Because there's a lot of confusion. A lot of people think a mentor is there to fix you, which is definitely not the case. Some of my clients have been told, usually by their boards, that this is something they should do. And if they're not really willing, I'd want to find that out quite quickly. I may ask them if they've ever had a coach or mentor in the past, formal or informal. So who's helped them? If they can't think of anybody who's ever helped them, then chances are we're not going to get off to a wonderful start, right? Because that suggests that they have trouble getting or receiving or remembering help. Because everybody's been helped by loads of people if they got anywhere. Sometimes I'll ask them, most of my questions are very simple, which are the bits of your job you really love and which are the bits you don't, because nobody loves all of it. So those sorts of things.
Yeah.
They're really testing questions. They're exploratory questions.
Right. That's great. I also like to ask a question that kind of gives me an idea of where their head is at in regards to learning, like how
That's
intentional
interesting.
have they been,
Yeah.
That's another one that I kind of like to do too sometimes. What have been some of the most impactful questions that you have pondered over the course of your leadership journey?
I'm trying to think because there are a whole handful of them. What would I see if I were wrong? So I'm going to do such and such because I think it's the right thing to do. What would the evidence be that it is not the right thing to do? That's a very important question for me. It's about what am I missing? It's who gets hurt. Every decision usually favors somebody over somebody else or something over somebody else. So what are the costs here, really? And if you say there are no costs, then you're definitely not finished, right? A question which is pretty new for me, but I think a really good question. What happens if if whatever it is we're doing is really, really successful? Because success carries its own problems. You could say, well, if people who invented automobiles had thought about that, that would be interesting to know what their answer was. They would certainly have no idea. It's a good test. if we've invented the automobile, and what happens if we're really successful is that they cover the planet. Are we sure we want to do this? Who's not in the room? If this turned out to have been very successful, why? And if it turns out not to be successful, why? So I think a lot about kind of pre-mortems as well as post-mortems. If this project's going to fail, why will it fail? Let's think about that before we dive in. So those sorts of questions, I think. And also have, who are the people I should have talked to about this? Who are the people I know who would have something really to offer?
Excellent questions. In your amazing arc of leadership and coaching and everything that you've done, how important, or what is the importance of emotional intelligence in leadership?
Oh, wow. Do we have another 5 years to answer this question? I mean, it's very interesting. My daughter's home at the moment. We've just been talking about this. I think you really can't be a leader if you don't have some form of emotional intelligence. I don't think you get to be a leader if you don't. You can get quite high on skills alone, but I don't think people will follow you if you aren't able to take an interest in them. And I am really stunned by the degree to which lots of very ambitious and very clever people don't take an interest in the people around them. And the consequence of that really is that they're not great leaders. I mean, they just can't be, because they don't know who's around them. I think what, the great skills that emotional intelligence, or the great capabilities that emotional intelligence brings you, is a good sense of who's happy, who's unhappy, who's stretched, who's not stretched, what are good combinations of people, how to take the temperature. I mean, I think a lot of people with very high degrees of emotional intelligence do this without even thinking about it. They walk into the office and they have taken the temperature unconsciously already. So I think, part of what it brings you is a much greater capacity to make sense of what's going on around you.
I love that. It's almost like, that's amazing. It's almost like an artist looking at a painting versus a non-painter looking at a painting. If I looked at a painting, I'm going to see, here's these 5 colors that are in the painting. A painter is going to see, an artist is going to see, the shading and the lighting and the tension between the images or whatever. You see a lot more with emotional intelligence than without emotional intelligence. That's an excellent way to put that. I love that, Margaret. That's excellent.
Yeah. Well, I think leadership is much more of an art than a science. I mean, I know everybody tries terribly hard to turn it into a science. I'm not quite sure why. I think they have a deep misunderstanding of science. But anyway, I think it is more of an art than a science. And I think that the really great leaders I've worked for or with have had, they're very creative people, and they have a capacity to make sense of the world around them that is not entirely rational. And they've learned over time that whatever you want to call it, it's very smart.
Absolutely. So with those executives that you have worked with that have a tendency towards transactional leadership, or the task over the people and the compassion, the empathy and that kind of thing, what have you found helpful in working with them to develop that areas that they're lacking in?
I guess the first thing I really, really, really focus on is getting them to listen better. And there are quite a lot of different ways you can do that. I do this with my master's students too. I mean, one thing I've done is I've asked very senior leaders to go to their next meeting and say nothing. Because if you go in, as many leaders or people in senior positions do, if you go into a meeting thinking, I know what I want the answer to be, and I'm determined to land it, you'll hear almost nothing. You're just waiting for the moment to jump in, land your brilliant solution, and wait for the applause. So I'll tell people to go into a meeting and promise me they will not say a word. If you go into a meeting knowing you're not going to say anything, boy, do you hear different things. And you start picking up patterns, and you start noticing who's talking, who's not talking. You start thinking about, but nobody's mentioned X. And then maybe somebody does, but maybe somebody doesn't. Maybe somebody doesn't for the whole meeting. And you think X is the most important thing. They find the clients I've asked to do this regard it as, I think, quasi torture, but they come away from it really transformed. Very often they'll come away much more appreciative of the qualities of intelligence around the table. They'll discover that people are better than they thought they were, or they'll have a better sense of who's doing great, who's not doing great. They'll often discover they didn't need to be at that meeting at all, which is fantastic for people who, scarcely get to know their children before they've left home. But it really makes them think about, who have we got? How's it working? Is it working? If it's not working, why isn't it working? It's a fantastically liberating thing, going into a meeting and only listening. And it's very, very well demonstrated that if you go in wanting to contribute, you will spend much more of your cognitive capacity thinking about your response and how to get it on the table than you will listening to what anybody around you has said. So that's one of the things I will always start with, is how good a listener are you? I mean, beyond that, it's, I typically, if I'm starting work with a new mentoring client, I will spend 2 days together with them. And people often think, oh my God, what do you have to talk about? Well, there's always more than enough to talk about. But I think what's really interesting is that generally overnight, at some point, either I or the client or both of us will see patterns in the conversations that if we just at the end of the day, gone home and that was it, we wouldn't have seen. So there's some processing that's going on. Knowing that we can immediately follow up with those observations, I think, is quite powerful. And I'm very, very interested in sensing, this is kind of obvious, sensing who are the big relationships in this person's life and who might you expect to be there that isn't there.
Awesome. Oh my goodness. This is so good. This is awesome, Margaret. Okay. What have been some of the most impactful resources along your own leadership growth journey?
That's a very good question. All the lousy business books I read. The reason being, I kept reading them thinking, yeah, but this doesn't make any sense. Well, this isn't what it feels like. Does this person even ever run a lemonade stand? Seriously? That was a huge provocation for me in becoming a writer, which is, I thought, it's one thing to study it, it's another thing to do it. So that's been very helpful to me. As I think we talked before, some of the very, very, very great bosses I was lucky enough to have in the course of my career. And I guess overwhelmingly, some of the really great people who've worked for me. And just, always thinking, how come they're doing well and others aren't? And what's the difference between them? And what's their mindset? And what's the mindset of others? But there are, I would say, 10 people I've worked with in the course of my career who I think, just the world of. Mostly they're still friends, though some of them are dead now. And the sheer excellence of their work taught me a lot. How are they able to do this? What is it they're doing? How are they so creative, or how are they so productive? Or I think that's probably where I've learned the most. And I think I said last time, I think I said that, I had one particularly brilliant boss at the beginning of my career, and I kind of thought all bosses were like that. And it took me a while to realize I had just lucked out fantastically. And now, as I watch some of my students and my own children and see what terrible, terrible, terrible managers they're usually subjected to, I feel more fortunate, and I feel more angry, I think, on their behalf, that people still have not absorbed this basic message. If you want to motivate somebody, take an interest in them. Care. That's it. Just care. And if you don't care, you have no right to manage anybody. I used to think, isn't it weird? I don't know if this is true where you live, but where we live, if you want to get a dog from a rescue home, and people have to come and check your property to make sure that it's up to snuff and that you're a kind of legal, decent, honest person, and the dog isn't going to be in a teensy-weensy shoebox of an apartment, And I think, hang on a second, how come people have to be checked out before they can rescue a dog that has no other home to go to? But any fool can be a boss and do incredible harm and damage to people. How are they allowed to do that? I mean, they could be traumatic in the effect that they have on people. And how is it we're paying more attention to rescued dogs? Not that I have anything against rescued dogs, but why are we so protective of them, and we're not protective of people who go into work on good faith, wanting to do a good job, and get, ignored, underrated, underestimated, overlooked, abused, terrorized, traumatized? How on earth is that allowed to happen? And I guess that's very motivating in my work, which is, I would like it to happen less.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Margaret, thank you for this is so fire. So what, I'm wrapping up here because I know you gave me some certain amount of time, and I really appreciate that. Of your books, your 6 books that you've written, which book would you recommend leaders start with?
Probably Willful Blindness.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, my husband pointed out when I wrote Bigger Prize, he said, "You're writing a trilogy, aren't you?" I said, "I don't know. Am I? Really? What do you think the third book's about?" He said, "I don't know." Well, he was spot on.
Wow.
I mean, I think Willful Blindness, Bigger Prize, and Uncharted are a trilogy, and I would read them in that order.
Okay. Okay.
And
Excellent.
I didn't plan it that way, but they fit together like gloves.
Okay. Excellent. What's the best way that we can follow you and get more of your information and resources and content?
Just my website, which is just www.mheffernan.com.
Okay. And I'll make sure to have that in the show notes. Margaret,
Super.
absolutely can't thank you enough. This has been
Ah,
amazing. And hopefully, maybe if I reach out down the future, I'd love to maybe do a round 2 with you at some point in the future if you'd be
yeah.
open to it.
Well, this has been fun, and thank you for your patience with the technical glitches. And I'm glad we both persevered.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. It's
Bye-bye.
been a real pleasure. Thank you. Cheers.